being marginalized as gay and lesbian. So what I'm trying to say is that lesbians face a double problem. Marginalized by the heterosexual community because of gayness, and also marginalized by the gay community.
I'm actually interested to hear what all you think about this topic. What are your expectations and what do you want to talk about?
I think it would help a lot if the Bible were rewritten according to LGBT-friendly terms and to refer to God as the parent instead of as the father, and maybe Christ the child, and that would be more inclusive and acceptable to everyone.
Well, in fact, in MCC liturgies, we do use what's called inclusive language, and we don't use father for God. We do use terms like parent or source of life or creator. We've even gone so far as not to use the word Lord for the most part, because it has such a male kingly domination concept to it, and try to find other terms for what the concept was after that. Certainly, for years, and I'm sure people do this here already, our language for humanity is inclusive. And when we read the Bible, if it uses the word man or brother or son, we'll inclusify that to be inclusive of the community.
Now, I think FCC has taken a step in that direction by referring to people like Susan as vice chairperson, haven't they? But perhaps you could carry that forward into the sermons and refer to God the parent and use that sort of language for every Sunday sermon or something like that. That would be a start.
Sure, I just want to take something that Jamie said. And I'm going to
get hated for this one. First, I think the discussion about the city is too politically correct. Okay? And it's unfortunate that some of the people who probably would have taken a more pro-male approach of God aren't present today. So I'm going to kind of put on that hat and get that role. Okay? I think that let's take a question I put to the panel. Okay? Why was Christ born male? Was that an accident? Was that God said it doesn't really matter, I just chose male? I mean, he could have chosen Christ as female, but he didn't. Jesus was born male. What do you think was the reason for that, or do you think there was no reason for that? And how does that then relate to our theology of the maleness or femaleness, or the male femaleness, or the non-male femaleness of God?
Well, we have
the fact that Christ was born male.
We have no proof that Christ was born male. He may have been XXY. Maybe nobody's examined him genetically. He was a product of parthenogenesis anyway. He was a product of immaculate conception, so there's no proof that he's actually male.
It's true that biologically we cannot actually prove the gender of Jesus, and it's not from Christ. But I think tradition generally has taken Jesus, the human being, as male. So my question to the panel is, why?
And the reverse question, why?
No, I think that's not.
Female.
say again.
The reverse question, why did the incarnation?
Oh yeah, that's right. Why wasn't Jesus Jacina or something, Or is it an irrelevant point?
Well, I think the first and most basic answer to your question is that it was the genetic lottery. I mean, the presumption is they weren't practicing the kinds of sex we practice today, where people try to determine the gender of their child or abort when they think it's not going to be right. I mean, I think it's irrelevant that he was born male. I think that's not what the incarnation message to me is about, and I think the tradition that has emphasized that is actually kind of heretical in terms of what the incarnation, the point of the incarnation really is, that God entered flesh, and by doing that, redeemed this flesh and blood, made this the seat of holiness and sacredness.
I find that a bit of a kind of a sidestep the issue. When you think about it, right? I mean, unless you're assuming a non-interventionist God, okay? Which in which case I can accept what you're saying. But assuming a God who actually engineered incarnation, assuming, which most Christians accept engineered incarnation, who then engineered this incarnation in a society that was extremely patriarchal, then the fact that he allowed, when he could have intervened, Jesus to be born male, in some ways then makes God complicit in the sin of patriarchy. So to just say there was a lottery, when you can accept that a God could have done something at that earlier stage, didn't, makes me then wonder, you know, it seems sidestepping the issue.
Maybe if, because Jesus, at the time when Jesus was born, because the society was so patriarchal, had Jesus been born a girl, she would have been not been able to go out and change the world, but been stuck at home reading children and washing, cooking and everything. So that's probably the reason why.
But when you make an assumption, then of course other things follow. Now, how was Jesus born? I mean, was Jesus born in the first place? This is when you talk about genetic lottery. He have either been born a male or female, you know. This human person that was born. So when you assume that God intervenes.
No, I think assume going. I was trying to say that God could have intervened, but if He allowed the law to.
No, you said that you could have intervened. I said God could not intervene. This is what I'm trying to say. See, if you assume God could intervene, then you say that God said that my incarnation is going to be male. But if you, unless now you say that the Holy Spirit is something else than the sperm, you know, then there's a different question altogether. So that doesn't bring up the point that Jesus was born a male by the intention of God. If you talk about the process of birth itself.
So I think, you know, I think that we bring it closer to home. Then we are now talking about that, you know, God didn't intervene, and there's the incarnation, the gender of Jesus the human was not an intended part of the incarnation. I think now we're getting to something a bit more core, which I think most or many Christians in Singapore, for instance, would probably disagree. You know, I think we're now reaching something that's a little bit more core, and I think it's worth exploring a little bit more. Was the gender of Jesus something that was a core part of the intention of the incarnation or not? And why or why not? Most evangelical Christians would disagree with the idea that the gender of Jesus was not fundamental to the incarnation.
Well, they disagree with the gender of Jesus. They disagree that it was a sperm that created Jesus. It was the Holy Spirit. How are you going to argue with that?
I think maybe one comment is like, a few times the panelists have made a comment that God transcends gender. In a way, I think it's kind of, it has somewhat patriarchal associations for me, in the sense that I rather tend to think of God as embodying gender, so that in the incarnation, gender matters too. And both gender, male and female, and I tend not to see them as not just simply distinct and complementary, because but rather, drawing together ideas about process theology, and also as gay men, how we find usually gender is something that's fluid, where we move from one end to another end, sometimes in drastic fashion. And also, and in addition to that, gender is often social forces acting to socialize us in certain ways. And if we look at the witness of the Hebrew scriptures about how God consistently challenges us, I think we are quite likely to end up with one conclusion, that God is